Welcome to the third session from Resistance to Redesign, Women Transforming Work. Today's session is Beyond the Glass Ceiling, Designing Tomorrow's Workplaces. My name is Deborah Davis, and I'm the president and co-founder of the Women's History Project, and I'm delighted to be hosting this event. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling from the unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The Algonquin people have lived on and cared for this land, specifically the Kishissippi, Ottawa River watershed, since time immemorial, serving as its traditional stewards and defenders. Tell us where you're calling from in the chat and a bit about yourself. The Women's History Project's vision is to build a future where gender equality is a lived reality and women's stories, past and present, are honored, amplified, and deeply woven into Canada's collective consciousness. Our ambition is to ensure the next generation of women see their role in our history fully reflected in the stories that we are told. We didn't get here by ourselves. We are a not-for-profit organization focused on public education through an events program and development of women's history productions. We are meeting at a moment when the future of work in Canada is being rewritten by AI and technology, by industrial transformation, and by the accelerating demand for care. And women are standing at the center of this shift, carrying both the greatest risks and the greatest opportunities. Let's start with the reality of where women work today. Canada has 3 million paid care economy workers. About 75% are women. That means nearly 1 in 5 workers in this country is a woman working in healthcare, education, childcare, community organizations, or social services. These are essential jobs, yet they are chronically undervalued, understaffed, and underpaid. At the same time, the sectors shaping Canada's next economy, AI, technology, advanced manufacturing, mining, infrastructure, remain overwhelmingly male-dominated. Women make up just over 30% of the digital workplace and only 9% of senior leadership in tech. In AI-specific roles, the share is likely even lower. And while 80% of women work in jobs highly exposed to AI disruption, women adopt AI tools at rates 25% lower than men. That is a dangerous gap: high exposure, low participation. This is the core challenge of the future of work for women. We are overrepresented in the sectors that are essential but undervalued, and underrepresented in the sectors that are growing, well-paid, and influential. So the question today before us is not simply what is the future of work, it is who gets to shape it, who benefits from it, how can women take advantage of opportunities? Will women be the architects of the next economy or passengers, and how will our voices be heard? To discuss this, we have an extraordinary panel. I'll just introduce you in just half a moment. But before we begin, we would like to take a moment to thank our special guest today. I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. I'd also like to thank the Women's History Project's board members and our sponsors and partners, with a special shout out to the English Catholic Teachers Association. And about this event, please feel free to make comments or questions in the chat. Following the remarks, there'll be a good amount of time for a moderated question period. Any questions that are in the chat will be forwarded to the panelists for comments following our activity. We will support that Q&A by sending questions to panelists for the response and making sure that they get back in touch with you. It's a pleasure now for me to introduce our panelist. Judy Rebick, author, activist, and now strategic advisor to the Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce. Judy Rebick is a celebrated journalist and political activist. Rebick became prominent in the 1980s as a pro-choice leader and advocate for women's rights. She was the director for Henry Morgentaler in the late 1980s. From 1990 to 1993, she was president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. From 94 to 98, she co-hosted a popular political debate show on CBC Newsworld. And in 2001, she helped launch Rabble.ca, an online multimedia news and discussion site, serving as its publisher until 2005. A widely published freelance journalist, Rebick is the author of 7 books, including 10,000 Roses, The Making of a Feminist Revolution, Transforming Power from the Personal to the Political, Occupy This, and Heroes in My Head, a memoir, in 2018. How to Be a Troublemaker will be released in 2027. Next is Shyra, Dr. Shyra Barberstock, a member of the Kebaowek First Nation, co-founder and CEO of Kebaonish, Inc. Dr. Barberstock is an Anishinaabe entrepreneur, scholar, speaker, and nationally recognized leader in Indigenous business and women's entrepreneurship. She is the co-founder of Kebaonish, an Indigenous-led tea and coffee company rooted in culture, reciprocity, and social impact, and co-founder and founding principal of Asqua Consulting, an Indigenous consulting firm focused on Indigenous economics, governance, inclusion, and systems transformation. She currently serves as an adjunct professor at both the Smith School of Business and the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Queen's University, where she teaches on Indigenous business, reconciliation, and community-centered approaches to economic development. Linda Krebs is a global head of talent acquisitions in Nokia. She has 20 plus years of experience designing recruitment strategies that connect top talent with transformative opportunities. As global head of talent acquisitions and corporate functions at Nokia, she partners with senior executives to shape global workforce strategies, deliver market-driven insights, and embed inclusive hiring practices that strengthen organizational capacity. Julie Savard-Shaw is the executive director of the Prosperity Project, a national Canadian charity dedicated to advancing women's economic participation and leadership. A seasoned policy strategist with more than 15 years of experience, she has built her career at the intersection of gender equality, public policy, and systems level change. Julie previously served as senior advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada, where she helped spearhead the country's first feminist international assistance policy and contributed to the Canada-US Council for the Advancement of Women Entrepreneurs and Business Leaders. She later supported the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, overseeing the Task Force on Women in the Economy, a key federal initiative on women's post-pandemic recovery. I've asked our team to put the full profiles in the chat. So I'd like to open the floor to our guest speakers. And if I may, I'd like to start with Judy Rebick.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I want to make a little correction. I was not the director for Dr. Morgenthaler, like no one could direct Dr. Morgenthaler. I was a spokesperson for the pro-choice struggle. And I make that correction because I think too often people think it was only Dr. Morgenthaler. But without our movement, this never would have happened that we won legal abortion. It was the combination of his bravery in the court case and our actions in the street and talking to people. And I say that because I think it's important people understand how change happens and doesn't happen just by one brave individual. As brave as he was, and he was very brave. So I'll just leave that. When Deborah first asked me to do this panel, I was going to focus on self-employed women because they are the part of the economy that everyone has forgotten and never thought about. Even those of us who have been self-employed don't think about it. Business doesn't think about it. Government doesn't think about it. Economists don't think about it. Labor doesn't think about it. But it's over 1 million women, over 2 million people who have no benefits, almost no benefits. They don't have the benefits of salaried workers. They don't have the benefits of businesses. And I'm going to come back to that. But since then, the Liberal initiative, Carney's initiative of the Major Projects Office has come out. And in my view, it is a major assault on women's rights, not a small one. It's as big as any on economic equality, as big as anything I've ever seen, because not only is almost all the money going to industrial jobs, construction, etc., as Deborah pointed out, in its huge majority male jobs, but there is nothing for care work, including daycare, which, as you know, the Trudeau Liberals finally implemented after 50 years of struggle. 50 years we've been fighting for nonprofit childcare, accessible childcare. We finally got $10 a day under the Trudeau government, and Carney is not defending it. As you all know, we have right-wing premiers who are trying to drive it back or trying to make sure for-profit childcare gets the money, which, as we've seen in Quebec, can undermine the accessibility. And so and no money to build childcare centers, which we need to do because there was a huge response to $10 a day childcare, and now there's a big waiting list, huge waiting list. But also because all the other care work is not funded, and and it means that not only women who are in healthcare, in mental health care, and in long-term care and daycare, as I mentioned, um, are not going to be able to win, uh, more support for their living. And so it's a real assault on women's equality because the jobs that women do are under attack. That's the only way you can say it, and not valued in the economy. And because I've been working on the issue of self-employed women for the last 3 years, I know what it means to not be valued, right? No, no, the majority, less than I lost the stat. I'm terrible remembering things, but I think it's 30% of self-employed women get access to parental support, parental leave, because not leave, but actual financing of parental leave. If we're salaried, we get under EI, but they don't get access unless they go through this very complicated system, which most of them don't do. And so the majority don't get any payment when they have to take parental leave. They have they have to provide their own contribution to pension. Um, there's no employer contribution, and the government doesn't make up for that. They have basically no government benefits and not much interest in unions in organizing them to get stronger benefits like paid parental leave and other benefits. And they get taxed like a business gets taxed, you know, and that's not fair because they don't have the resources that businesses have. So that's something that, I think given the attack on women's rights, which we see very clearly in the United States, and we don't see it overtly in Canada, but it is happening. And I think we need to understand that it is happening in subtle ways. Mr. Carney, many of you may support him, but he's very clever because he appears to be such a kind and caring person, but in reality, what he's doing is supporting a very vicious neoliberal agenda, very similar to what Paul Martin did in the Liberal government way back when. Paul Martin is the person who cut welfare. So I really want to sort of send a bit of an alarm out that we really need to get women's groups together to stand up against this and to insist that care work be financed and that care work is part of the strategic economy. It's not separate from it. It's like saying care work costs money. Oh, but we'll invest in other industries. So they spend billions on giving money to corporations that are making a lot of profits and say that, oh, well, giving money to care work isn't good for the economy. And that is nonsense. It's not true, and it's wrong, and it's very patriarchal and sexist. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Judy. We've had these conversations before. I'd like to go to Shyra Barberstock. Please, Shyra, for your opening remarks.
Judy's a hard act to follow.
But we do our best, right?
Yeah. I don't know if I have too much for opening remarks yet. I might wait more so for the questions, but I can say in terms of this conversation, in terms of my focus, I really connect with Judy with talking about self-employed women. For me, I've been an entrepreneur for most of my life, which makes me a very unusual person. And I've also worked as a supporter of entrepreneurs, generally Indigenous entrepreneurs, but I'm also very interested in how do we support women and to be able to support them with their businesses. And as women, as Indigenous people, we have a lot of extra obstacles to overcome. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation with the panel. I'm honored to be with such a group of distinguished, accomplished women, and I'm sure there's going to be some really good good conversations, and also can be, are there good solutions that will come out of this as well? If there's policymakers on the call, can we talk about it? Because I've seen that we've been part of programs through my companies that have supported. So for example, we had the Quabiz program for Indigenous women entrepreneurs in partnership with Queen's University. And it was a very successful program that went on for 3 years. It supported over 90 Indigenous women entrepreneurs through an accelerator, a mentorship program, a workshop series. And after the 3 years were over, all of the funding went away. It was not renewed by the government. And all of those 90 women who saw us as their supporters, all of a sudden that was gone. And so sometimes I do feel like there can be a disconnect between what's needed on the ground and community, whether that's the entrepreneurship community or women in business or Indigenous people in business. And I do feel like there can be that disconnect, that it's that checkbox. We did this wonderful thing. We supported Indigenous women entrepreneurs for 3 years, but then the funding goes away. We need long-term funding, long-term support, if we're ever going to make it somewhere. So I guess that would be part of my opening remarks, but I really am looking forward to the discussion. I think it's an important one, and I'm looking forward to being part of it and hearing what the other panelists have to share as well. So Chimagwech.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shyra. Over to Linda. Linda, corporate. You represent sort of the corporate face on this panel.
I do, yes. Again, I am very, very honored to be part of the distinguished panel today. And I echo Shyra, and I don't know how I can really follow suit in terms of Judy's introduction aspect. I come from it from a little bit of a slightly different edge, essentially because I work for an organization where I see, and I'm really looking forward to the panel as well too. I come in the sense of a lens of talent acquisition in HR. And, when we look at women and emerging industries, Canada can't really resolve the labor shortages while overlooking like half of the talent pool that we currently have, right? And for me, representation really starts before the hiring, long before the hiring processes. And the support role, just to sort of echo a little bit in terms of the care economy. I mean, care work is part of the economic infrastructure. And really, even though I work for an organization and we are in STEM, what I've been really focused on over the last 6 years or so while I was working at Nokia was really trying to bring up, and try to have women not just participate in the future economy, but like really shape it, because AI and technology, there's so much going on with, women in the workforce in 2026. There's so many different factors that, affect it. And we see a lot of benefits, but also a lot of, I would say, risk per se. It's an opportunity and responsibility. And so, again, I'm just really looking forward to, more so of contributing to the conversation today, and giving a different lens to just not only care and maybe the self-employed individuals, but also from individuals and women in the workforce.
There we go. Thank you very much, Linda. And over to Julie, the Prosperity Project.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I come to today's panel from the perspective of course, the Prosperity Project and what we do, which is that we collect data from Canada's top 500 companies in Canada to look at the representation of women at 4 levels of leadership by identity. So for me, and Linda sort of touched on this, it's not just about having women in companies or as part of the future of work. So representation matters, but it's about who sits at those decision-making tables and really creating the space and the systems that enable that. So looking forward to the conversation today, as everyone has said. And on the piece that Judy mentioned for the care economy, the Prosperity Project, and the women that founded the Prosperity Project, I should say, because I wasn't there at the time, advocated very strongly for the National Action Plan, and it was a great success. But yes, we all need to do more to make sure that there's more investments needed. I also think, though, that while the care economy needs investment, the investments that are being made right now in some of the more male-dominated sectors also represent an opportunity to increase the representation of women. And so while I'm not saying we need less investment in that sector or more investment in a different sector, I think we need both, and we don't need to pit one against the other necessarily, and just recognize that both sectors are necessary for Canada's economic advancement, particularly at a time when with everything happening geopolitically and economically, if we want to leverage the industries that we have, the natural resources that we have, and I think Shyra, you said that, or maybe Linda, anyways, I can't remember. We can't ignore half of Canada's population, and so let's find a way to make sure that women are around the decision-making table, are represented in those industries, but that we have the care economy to support them in doing so.
Thank you very much, Julie. That's very helpful. We've heard a little bit about care economy and advocacy, entrepreneurship and the Indigenous lens, corporate and multinational, thinking around that, data collection, representation. That's a really important, the important one is, what does the data say and who sits at the table? We're going to cover three particular areas for this afternoon of conversation: forces shaping the work, equity and access, and leadership and lessons. So let's talk about the headlines. There is rightly so, in the face of economic disruption coming from the US, the emphasis on trade, diversification and expansion, major projects, defense infrastructure. All of that's important. All of that's good. However, what will the impact be? I mean, part of it is also attracting and retaining women in those industries. I think that's a big part of it. So what does the future hold for women entering and transforming the workforce, and what are the emerging opportunities in those evolving industries? And maybe, Julie, we can start with you and then go to Linda after that.
Sure. So I would actually flip the question around, and when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about it from what would be the impact if we didn't include women? Because right now the low representation of women in these sectors is going to limit Canada's ability to deliver on what we are trying to do. And so right now, the companies in the trades, in energy, mining, manufacturing, they're drawing from a relatively aging and narrow and stagnant talent pool. But if we want to be able to deliver the projects that this government wants to deliver, they're going to have to increase or open up, let's say, the talent pool to include women, to include people from underrepresented group. I mean, Indigenous people, and Shyra, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but they're the fastest growing population in Canada, and yet they are still incredibly underrepresented in most positions of leadership across Canada and in most of those sectors. But, tapping into that talent pool is going to be necessary if these companies want to succeed and if Canada as a country wants to deliver on these projects. So while I think maintaining the status quo of how these companies operate, a culture that isn't the best for women or underrepresented groups, an environment where, sort of differences of opinions and work-life balance and everything that women look for in a role, maintaining that status quo would mean that they don't attract the women, or even if they were able to attract them, they wouldn't retain them. And so in the long run, again, it just goes back to not being able to achieve what the government's trying to achieve. And therefore, that would have a negative impact on Canada's economy and on us being able to, for example, invest in the care economy, being able to invest in different social programs. I think it's all related. And we need to look at the systems that are enabling the status quo to remain as it is.
I'd like to go to Linda, if I may, because when we talked earlier this week, you were talking about how Nokia attracts talent in working with universities. So maybe you could say a few words about attracting and then retaining talent.
Yeah, I can give maybe some concrete examples, but just to add to Julie's point, there's lots of studies out there that talk about bringing in diverse perspectives and the value of diversity in your workforce, right? And in the private sector, there's many studies that demonstrate that it leads to innovation, it leads to productivity, it leads to new ideas and initiatives. And in the end, actually, the company benefits from it financially, even, and so there is profitability as a result of these innovative thoughts and diverse thoughts and inputs. And so I think it's absolutely critical that you have, when you look at diversity, that one sector is, women or Indigenous or whatever, in terms of different individuals coming into the organization. As an example, and I was sharing, Deborah, earlier this week that, at Nokia, probably about 6 years ago, I would say now, when I first started with the organization, I was responsible for looking at the next generation of talent. And one of the aspects was we were having a lot of difficulties filling some of the skills that we were looking for, because again, they're more advanced technologies, they're niche skill sets, they're a lot more costly, as well as very difficult to try to find that particular talent. We also had, essentially, we had leaders who really valued making sure that they wanted to have diversity within the Canada operations and, bringing in, diversity into our organization. And so we're challenged on two ends. And so what I did actually, which was kind of interesting, was I went to all the post-secondary schools that higher education that we partnered with across Canada, and essentially asked them, what they are doing in order to bring in diverse individuals into their faculties. And many of them, actually majority of them, I would say, did not necessarily have data. They did not have, they did not think that to, sort of focus in terms of, let's say, for example, female individuals into their STEM programs. And very few schools actually did. And then for us, our main importance was, if a school wasn't focused on it, how are we going to focus in terms of recruiting? Because again, going back to what I said earlier on, is that, representation starts long before our hiring practices, right? And so if post-secondary schools are not focused in terms of bringing in diverse talent into their faculties in these niche skill sets like IT and engineering, how are we going to recruit and increase also diversity within our population? And so I had a lot of post-secondary schools actually say to me at the time, like, you're the first person that's ever asked this of us. And within the next year, all of a sudden, all of them started to now get a lot more requests from other companies about diversity and bringing in diversity and the value add of that. And so they started providing more statistics, and they provided more. And then we also saw benefits from it, because then we selected the schools that, actually showed diversity, so an increase in terms of bringing in more visible minorities or female or Indigenous population into their faculties, because then those are the populations that we can bring in talent into our organization. And so it was a really good win for us, in the sense of, it really does, when we talk about women and emerging industries and niche skill sets, it's really affects kind of how we recruit and how we bring in talent. And then we also did other programs to try to retain them, Julie. Like, as you mentioned, that's something else in another topic, but that's kind of an example of, what we did essentially at Nokia to kind of bring in, diverse talent into our organization, and the importance of it, really, because then we saw, diversity, like diverse thoughts. We saw tons of innovation. We saw reverse mentoring, sponsorships. We saw leaders have different ideas and being challenged. This next generation was grew up in the digital workforce, and so they brought in new ideas and challenged the status quo, because again, a lot of our senior individuals are from that male predominant environment, and so now they're bringing in and working with different individuals, and it's challenging them in great ways, I think, really, to think otherwise, right? Like AI and efficiencies and stuff like that. So yeah.
Very, very helpful. But I think also, Linda, that, there's a lot more girls going into engineering and STEM courses. They might get jobs, but they don't stay in the jobs.
And that's what the next, I would say, if we were to talk about it, that's a whole nother subject. But yes, absolutely.
But that's also, it'd be interesting, Shyra, and then I'll go to Judy. Shyra, I know at one point, and I hope it's still the case, that even in government procurement, you may or may not know this about, a certain amount of government contracts have to go to Indigenous organizations or Indigenous companies, but businesses. So they only do it for Indigenous, but we could push for, can they do it with women? What about women companies? Making sure that the supply chain that supports the industries in the major projects are also, we're also more aware of those supply chains. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to comment on that. So just for people that are listening in case they're unaware. So for example, the federal government is mandated to do a minimum of 5% Indigenous procurement across all federal departments. Other governments also have their targets. You'll find there's actually a lot of people in industry and even corporate Canada that have Indigenous procurement targets. But just to let you know why the 5%, because the Indigenous population makes up approximately 5% of the Canadian population. Why did they put that together? Because the Indigenous procurement used to be way lower for the federal government. I think it was actually closer to 1% or less. I'm not sure where it is right now, but it was incredibly low. And so that's why that came to be, and that's why it's incredibly important. But Indigenous people were underrepresented in procurement opportunities. So that's why there's set-asides. And there's set-asides for specific things. So sometimes there's procurement opportunities that are happening in First Nation communities or that involve Indigenous people where it's most appropriate that it's Indigenous led. So that's important to point that out. Now, in terms of women entrepreneurship, because we also need to support that, where you'll find that is actually in social procurement policies. And I don't think that's well known, but when we get into social procurement and social procurement set-asides, that's when we're getting into women entrepreneurs, people of color, LGBTQ, newcomers, veterans, people with disabilities, and that's actually where those opportunities are. So if anyone on the call is an entrepreneur, especially a woman entrepreneur or in any of those groups that I mentioned, look for social procurement opportunities. And so it's incredibly important. But just commenting on what some of the other people have talked about, the importance of diversity, and even AI. Deborah, you were talking about that technology and AI, and I can tell you that Indigenous people are really underrepresented in tech and AI, and so are women. You had mentioned that. And there's so many powerful things with including women. And Julie, I loved what you said. What would happen if women aren't included? Like, women are, really good communicators, trust builders, ethics, collaboration, community leadership. Women they're community builders, right? It's so important to have that inclusion. We can bridge systems, cultures, relationships, right? It's not just about the technical outputs. And Indigenous people specifically, so I did my PhD looking at Indigenous procurement as a catalyst for community building. My master's looked at reconciliation through Indigenous social innovation. A lot of Indigenous businesses are actually social enterprises using business to solve social and environmental issues. And so I think part of this is greater inclusion for women, for Indigenous, but also setting them up with the skill set. So AI, incredibly important, so is tech, but how are we getting people early on so that they can be early adopters and on top of it? And making sure that that's aware, making sure policies aligned. I know when I was looking at the opportunities for entrepreneurs, there's been certain years where it's been really geared towards youth, where policy is saying we need to support the youth, and it's important. I'm not saying don't support the youth, but when we were running the Quabiz program, you might find it interesting that most of my entrepreneurs that were starting new businesses were in their 40s and up. They were mostly older people that were starting entrepreneurship. And so it's really about connecting in with these communities and asking them what they need instead of being prescriptive and looking at the real statistics on, what are the greatest populations of people that need support, and how can we create that circle of support around them to give them whatever it is they need. So, at the heart of it, bringing it back to women and nation builders, economic drivers, and how do we put that support in place? Because AI is here. Like how can we support more women? Trust me, if I had all of the skills and I could code for breakfast using vibe coding, I would. But where are those courses to learn how to do all of this so that we can succeed as entrepreneurs and leaders?
Yeah, it's not only about the adoption of AI, but it's also the AI bias. If all the people that are working in AI are men, you would think that AI would have a male bias, and we've got to protect ourselves from that. We've got to make sure that it's a balanced bias, that there's a balance. Yeah.
And cultural bias, I was reading about that. That's also a frightening one, because you've got people using it all over the world. Does it have a Western bias?
Right.
For example, you're right, does it have a male bias? And because that does affect the way that we think, the way we function, and everything that we do, especially since it's becoming everyone's second brain.
Yeah. Part of my first brain. Judy, over to you. Can you comment on some of these, the other
Sure.
answers?
Well, one of the things I want to talk about is representation, okay? Because I come from the generation that fought for pay equity and employment equity, and fought, when there were like 3 women in parliament, to get more women into politics and to get more women into all these things. And I have to say that the results are grim. Yes, we changed the lives of millions of women. That's true. And there are way more women in the workforce and in leadership and in politics. But if you look at the areas we're talking about, we see a different story. So, for example, there were groups in the 70s and 80s, women into trades, women into industry. I myself got a job in a McDonnell Douglas factory, okay, when I was 24 years old, because we wanted to have more women in industrial jobs. And I won't go into the stories unless you want me to, but I was pretty tough even then. And I had to defend the other women, like literally physically defend them from the male attacks. Okay. And, it was the days when men would have naked women posted all over the place, that kind of thing. Right. And I looked up the stats on women in trades. Okay. Because like I say, there was a big campaign for years, decades, women in trades. Electricians, 3.5% women. Carpenters and plumbers, 3%. General construction, 5%. Okay, now if you look under the general stats, skilled trades is 5 to 10% women, but that includes hairdressers, right? So women's jobs. So we made very little progress. And part of it is definitely and it's patriarchy, it's sexism, because those jobs are almost impossible to survive in, right? Because of the sexism and because we haven't overcome that, and the sexual violence, right? And so, we were talking about female politicians earlier. I think maybe that was in the green room, but about how we're losing female politicians due to online attacks. But if you're working on a construction site, it's a lot more than online attacks that you're getting, right? And so I think we have to address this problem of the persistence of patriarchy better than we ever have. Better than my generation did. When we started, I always tell it, when we started the feminist movement, our main slogan was no more patriarchy, no more shit. But as we made gains and reforms, we let go of that notion that it's a system that we have to change. And that's another reason why valuing care work is very important. And Julie, you said this thing of like we need the construction jobs and so on to create the profit in the economy so that we can better pay care jobs and so on. But that is a misconception. Like care is part of the economy, right? Why is it we have an economic system that only looks at certain things, and one of it is profit, right? And to me, large profits does not benefit the whole of society. It benefits a very small group of people. And so our whole way of looking at the economy is very patriarchal as well. And so all of these things work to the disadvantage of women, Indigenous people, and others. Uh, uh, yeah, so I guess I'll just leave it there because I talked more at the beginning.
Yeah, yeah. But the other thing too is, the care economy, but we haven't even touched on women who work in the arts and culture sector,
Yes.
and women that work in organizations, environmental organizations, so all of that kind of advocacy and community work that they do. So we haven't touched on that. I'm going to keep an eye on the time because I want to go into our equity and access part. And by the way, I'm going to say, if you want to learn more about Judy's time at McDonnell Douglas, you have to read her book, Heroes in My Head. Excellent book. I interviewed also Judy for our Thousand Voices, a Thousand Stories, and it was a great privilege to do that a couple of years ago. Anyway, equity and access, and you just started to touch on it, Judy. In 1970, and I actually went back to the report, the Royal Commission on the Status of Women tabled a report in Parliament in 1970, and there was a chapter on the economy and, women in the Canadian economy. And that included issues such as paid and unpaid work. It highlighted the need for adequate standard of living and the shortage of childcare facilities. It talked about part-time employment, opportunities to learn skills, and attitudes relegating women to lower paying occupations. So that was 56 years ago. And of all of the developments, and we've made great gains, and a lot's changed. But the issues of the 1970s, the 60s and 70s, some of those are still, they're still a hangover. We still have them, and it's a headache. So much has changed, and we should celebrate those changes. So in discussions of women's progress in the workplace, who is centered, who's left out, and we've talked a little bit about it, but let's talk more about the 2026 issues facing women from different communities. And Judy, do you want to start off with that? And then we'll go to Julie. Julie.
Yeah. So I guess I'll come back to the self-employed because a lot of artists and writers are self-employed, right? And so the lack of support for self-employed people, self-employed women, also connects to the lack of funding for the artistic center and to the point I made earlier, which is what we think about when we think about the economy, right? Like and another thing that we're working on is to change the measure of the GDP to have and this is a big movement that's happening in Europe now, is to have a different measure of economic health than the GDP, because the GDP doesn't benefit most people. The fact that the GDP is higher is not necessarily a benefit to most people. So I think that's a part of it. But the thing about self-employment, and this is something that I'm noticing a lot lately, is there's a way in which, and the other thing is the use of the term entrepreneurship. I just want to address that too, because KWCC, when I first started working there, they were part of the whole entrepreneurship ecosystem, I think they call it. I can never remember that term. I think they call it an ecosystem or something. But anyway, of that whole system of entrepreneurs, and in fact, the Trudeau Liberals put quite a lot of money into, as you point out, into funding entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs. But the problem was that when we looked further, what we found out was actually only 20% of the members of KWCC, who we were all calling entrepreneurs, actually had small businesses, and 80% didn't. They were either solopreneurs, as we're calling them now, or they had made just some contract workers and didn't really benefit from the business kind of benefits. So, so that's another thing about framing things, right? And it's why it's important to get back to a more grassroots democratic process, to actually talk to people about what they need. Because I think our system has gotten more and more top down, more and more just listening to people at the top and people of privilege. And, you know, even if they might be a little more diverse than they used to be, they're still mostly white men, you know? And so I think that that's also part of it, the sort of takeover of politics by the pundit class, and that kind of thing. I think we need to think about. But the other thing that Canada had that the United States didn't have was, you know, we had a group called the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, and it was a coalition of, at one point, 600 women's groups across the country. And most of those women's groups were government funded. NAC was government funded too, but because we were so high profile, we could take on the government in a way that those smaller groups didn't feel they were able to do, because if they lost their funding, they couldn't provide the services anymore that they were providing. And we've lost that too. So now we have a lot of women's groups, and I know none of you are working with women's groups per se, but I still do, that are afraid to speak out against government, because if they lose their funding, then they lose the service that they're providing, right? And so it's much harder to organize as a feminist across issues because of that, right? And because we lost that instrument we had, which was NAC. And was there something else you wanted me to address?
Oh, I was just going to say something about self-employment. Isn't there some jurisdiction that's talking about how you can actually look at the universal basic income to help support some of the arts, the writers,
Yeah.
the musicians?
It's
to
a
take
very
on that?
yeah. It's a very controversial issue, and so nothing happens. The unions don't support it. A lot of people don't like it, and so it never happened. So I think actually Nancy Wilson, our CEO, she has come up with an idea of basic parental income. And so I think it's a way to get to basic income, like basic income for artists, is by a basic parental income. So one thing it recognizes is that having children is good for society, and the government should support it. Not that the government should force us to have children, but should we choose to have children, the government should support us in that. And right now, it really doesn't.
And the
And
fight,
so,
the
and
fight's been
especially
going
if
on
you're
for
self-employed. What? Sorry?
and the fight's been going on for 56 years.
Yeah, long time, and shouldn't be part of unemployment insurance. You're not unemployed because you're having a child. It's like it's wrong. It's just a wrong concept. And so the problem is that, you know, unions are really don't want to let go that unemployment insurance. And by the way, unemployment insurance has deteriorated to such a degree, like you can't live on it anymore. When I was young, we used to, I shouldn't say this, but anyway, you know, in service, in different groups we organized, we'd have half the people would work at a job, and the other half of people would volunteer in our group, and then we'd switch, and you'd quit your job, get unemployment insurance, and then you'd volunteer in your group, right? I don't know if you're old enough to remember that, Deborah, but
shouldn't mention
and,
it. I'm
the
going to
point
go.
I'm making here is not that we should go back to that, but unemployment insurance, you used to be able to live on it,
Yeah.
right? And now you can't. I mean, you can live on it, but you're going to be awfully poor.
Yeah.
And so,
maternity benefits for 17 weeks, you know.
what? Yeah, exactly.
Maternity
So
benefits, yeah.
plus you have somebody looking over your, anyway.
So I'm going to go over
yeah.
to Julie. I'm going to go over to Julie, and I'd like you to, pitch in. Much has changed, but what are some of the issues, and how do they manifest themselves differently across the different types of work? So, Julie, and then I'll go to Shyra and then Linda.
And then I think the part of the question was also like who's being left out, right? And I just want to say that I'm speaking about this, and I want to acknowledge my position of privilege as a white, cisgender, upper middle class woman. And I think Judy talked about this, like the people that are being sort of tapped on the shoulder to share their input and top down, like, are mostly white men, but we are also increasingly seeing white women. And so of the groups at the Prosperity Project that we make sure are included, and that's why we have disaggregated data, not just by men and women, but by Black women, Indigenous women, women of color, 2S LGBTQ women, and women with disabilities, is that we know that those women are not being included in those conversations. And so just to give you a bit of data here, and this is around more the representation at leadership levels, although that's often where, of course, the decisions are being made on what the culture will be like in the organization, what policies will be happening, right? So unfortunately, the representation of Indigenous women has dropped from a meager 3.1% in 2021 to 1% in 2025. So that's in Indigenous women in positions of leadership. Black women specifically in 2025 are at below 2% across all senior leadership roles in corporate Canada. And women with disabilities saw the sharpest drop and are barely at 1%. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. And that's also why at the Prosperity Project specifically, we've started bringing in grassroots groups that represent these women. Because what we're also noticing is that in organizations, they'll end up tapping the shoulder of that one Black woman who's supposed to speak on behalf of all Black women in Canada and all Black women in that company, right? And so it's adding a second job to the job that she's already doing. Or they're tapping me. I'm sure, Shyra, you have so many stories of, like, as the Indigenous women, can you tell us about what all Indigenous people are, experiencing? And it's just that emotional labor that that people don't need. And so we've started bringing together and doing roundtables, bringing corporate Canada to the table and having representatives of those groups to sort of speak truth to power a little bit, so that also the women that are in those companies, who are the Black women or the Indigenous women, don't fear the repercussion of speaking out to say, you know what, actually your policy is really not helpful, it's damaging, and you should change it. So I think it's really important when we're talking about who's being left out and who we need to include, to think about not just their identity, but their role and their relation to power in that context. So as I said, for us, it's more in the context of, like, changing the policies within a corporation, but I think that could be applicable for government writ large as well, or other institutions.
Good. Thank you. Linda, maybe you can talk about this from that corporate perspective. What's missing and how can we get other corporations to take a look at the data and realize there's big gaps?
Yeah, actually, it's funny because with, it's not funny, but I was going to say the exact same thing that Julie was going to say in terms of, what's missing in terms of that. But from a leadership standpoint, I mean, it's, I can only speak on behalf of Nokia, essentially, right? And it's practice what you preach, from that standpoint. And it has to, I guess, I think the leaders have to really actually take the step forward to actually make some of those changes and acknowledge those, right? And so without that, I think it'll be essentially difficult, and they have to ask those questions, those difficult questions, right? Like who's, for example, like, going back to Julie's comment, right? If, they're already now maybe potentially some females in leadership positions, but we have to ask, who is already closest to power? Like, are they the ones who have been promoted because they're closest to power? So like, which women are advancing? Which women are benefiting, for example, in terms of this? Which individuals are still being left behind? And so I think that I can only speak on behalf of Nokia from that perspective, but it's like having leaders really have that buy-in and then be able to advocate for that and actually, speak and ask those very difficult questions, essentially, and then implement them. But yeah, that's
Shyra, over to you.
A lot of really good points, and I'll echo some of it. But in terms of who's left out about women's progress, I think it's important. Julie, you touched on this. Not all women are experiencing the economy in the same way, right? Indigenous women, racialized women, disabled women, newcomers, rural women, low-income women often have increased barriers, and I think that's important because there are also just women that do have more privilege and have the networks, and so there are women that are experiencing a lot more challenges. So we can't talk about women as one universal experience. And access to opportunity really matters, right? It really matters. So access to capital, procurement opportunities, mentorship, networks, childcare, transportation, even broadband and internet. There's Indigenous communities that are still not connected to the internet, and that blows my mind. What is that going to do for your opportunities? What if your dream is to start a business? Can you imagine starting a business without the internet? Like, even having the internet is a form of privilege, isn't it? Right? And so that's really important. And then when it comes to self-employment, self-employment can be really empowering. I think one of the superpowers of employment is any one of us, we can start a business. We can be the leader of that business. We can hand select who we're working with. We can choose our own board. There's so much power in that. But then many women entrepreneurs are also carrying a more enormous risk, sometimes with limited support systems, right? We women-led SMEs, it's known that we struggle to access the same financing, the same contracts, the same growth opportunities as larger or male-led firms, right? And that's really valid. I heard a study a while back, and it came out of one of the major banks that if you were a woman, you were less likely to get funding than if you had walked in a man. If you had walked in through the door as a man wanting to start a business, you would have been more likely to get the funding. So that's really important. So procurement is a powerful tool for economic inclusion, but we have to have those support systems in place. And then in terms of not having a top-down approach, that's really important. And the other panelists have talked about that. But it is important to have those roundtable discussions, circles, design thinking, systems thinking, asset-based approaches, and asking people what they truly need to be supported and feel like they're being included. And we have to start there. And I think, Deborah, I think you even mentioned that, I can't remember who did, but a lot of the times it's a top-down approach. And sometimes the people writing policy and creating funding are actually disconnected to what's happening on the ground. And then the other thing that we're seeing is you'll see people that will say they're trying to have equity and inclusion, but they're tokenization and checkbox programs. And so I have talked to Indigenous people, who have been in situations where they've been invited and they thought it was going to be meaningful engagement just to feel tokenized and not heard, or whatever they shared is not actually put into practice. And it was literally just, great, you showed up, here's what we're going to do. So I do think that's really important. And then as entrepreneurs, for those as entrepreneurs, like, what can we do, to have more equity and inclusion? One thing I'm really super proud about with Kebaonish, that's my tea company, is that it's woman-led, right? And part of that is me. I'm the CEO. I own 51% of the company. I have consciously put a team of women around me. My partner Rai, he's also a co-founder and he's an important part of the company. But if you look at behind the scenes, there's about 3 or 4, women behind the scenes of Kebaonish really moving it forward. And I consciously will procure from other Indigenous entrepreneurs and women entrepreneurs, because it's important that I walk my talk, because I say, Indigenous inclusion is important. Supporting women in business is important. And so I do put that into practice through the way that I do business. And even though I'm a small business, I am playing my part, right? So as women, that's how we can also empower other women. Or if we're Indigenous entrepreneurs, that's how we can empower other Indigenous entrepreneurs. And, I'm also really, equity is really important to me. I also make sure I'm procuring from LGBTQ owned businesses, and working with people of color. And what studies show is the more diversity we have, the stronger we are in business and the more innovative we are. You know, so even if people don't even buy into that whole topic, if you just look at it from a business perspective, more diversity, more innovation, more success, right?
Yeah. There's a couple of comments there that I was quite interested. I think, Shyra, you mentioned that organizing without the internet. Well, Judy will know an awful lot about organizing without the internet. You know, again, the 60s, 70s, 80s, there wasn't an internet until the 1990s. So, you know, there was a lot of really good work. And women, you know, the women's movement was really quite high and quite, you know, high profile, made a lot of changes at that time. The data that you're collecting, Julie, I hope you put in the chat where they can see some of the research. I think that will be really important because, you know, I've known from living and being in Ottawa and part of the, you know, part of all of Ottawa, that data is really important. And if you're going to make your case, you really need to have the information and the metrics to substantiate your case. So I think that is really important. And then there was another point, but you were talking about really how do we organize ourselves. I'm just noticing the time. We've got about 20 minutes left, so we're going to move on to our third section. Leadership and lessons, and maybe we pivot and not talk about how can government and business leaders work towards building an equitable and inclusive future, but really what do we need to do to make sure that we are heard? How do, you know, what needs to be done so that government investments and public policy ensures that there's a gender-based balance in the workforce? Or public sector procurement. What can we learn from our past? You know, we're a history project. I know what it was. It was you mentioned something about finance, you know, going into a bank. You only have to read the chapter on women in the Canadian economy in the report on the Royal Commission on Status of Women, where married women had to have their husbands sign credit and they had their credit cards taken away. I mean, there's some really interesting similarities. So what can we learn from that second wave feminist movement that we could do now to make sure our voices are heard? So I would like to start with Linda. We'll go to Julie, Judy, and then Shyra.
I just wanted to add something from the previous conversation. I think, Shyra, just to add to your comment there, I think in terms of, like, let's say the women's movement, I think progress actually happened because women pushed for it, for example. So not because it happened naturally. You know, rights and opportunities can move forward, but they can also stall. And so I think, you know, for not only from a top-down aspect of things, but I think also too is that, you know, we are also constantly pushing as well too, and hopefully maybe the next generation shouldn't have to spend their energy providing that they belong, essentially. But you know, from that side, I just wanted to make that particular comment. But I think going forward, you know, I think there's a lot of different things actually can help, you know, from that perspective. Sponsorships, measurable outcomes, for example, psychological safety, and making sure that we have psychological safety for our individuals, you know, going through this. You know, I'm coming at from an HR lens, but you know what? The thing is, inclusion doesn't always really, it doesn't live only in HR. Like, I'm in HR, I live, breathe HR every single day. And, you know, it's not an HR strategy, right? And so, you know, it's not necessarily just speeches or HR. It has to show up in, like, let's say for me in the private sector, budgets and hiring decisions and leadership tables and showing up and public policies and things like that. You know, I've always been advocating the fact that it doesn't always just take, you know, one individual. It takes, you know, private industries, public industries, you know, post-secondary institutions, not only that, just education system in itself. And so I think, you know, that's a sort of a loaded question, but I think there's many different things, but it does start from us, you know, pushing for it from that perspective. That's my opinion anyways.
Julie.
Yes, I totally agree. I had one of my points here was put your money where your mouth is. Like, absolutely. I think capital is part of it. Maybe I'll jump to, you know, what we can learn from the 70s and 80s. And I think that's collective action. And Judy, you've touched on this, but I think right now there's a bit of a fragmented approach. There's the childcare people that are doing advocacy there. There's the gender-based violence people that are doing advocacy there. And if we want to see change that will be embedded in the systems, and if we are going to attempt to change this patriarchal view still present in society, like we're all going to need to work together. And yeah, and I think, you've talked, Deborah, about the NAC or NAC. I can't remember how you call it, the acronym, but thinking about something like that, for Canada. But I would say, and I don't know how it was back then, of course, but making sure though that that umbrella is inclusive enough so that what we consider like a women's organization or a women's group includes like a group like the Prosperity Project, for example, that we may not be seen as a women's group, but we work on making sure that women are part of the economy, that they are represented and increased representation in positions of leadership. So I think there's a lot that we can do together, much more than we can do individually. And I think even in the last, year since Prime Minister Carney's been elected, we've seen that when women's groups come together and ask, when the Minister for the Status of Women or Women and Gender Equality Canada was removed, and everyone came together and had those petitions, and the media was on it, that had an impact. Investments for women's groups, because we all worked together to make sure that, there wasn't a rollback of that investment. So yeah, I hope that we can all work together and just have a more inclusive umbrella.
Yeah. Thank you, Julie. One of my favorite subjects. Shyra, and then I'm going to give the last word to Judy, who will be very insightful when it comes to NAC and collective action. Shyra.
There's been so many good points made, so I'll try to add something a little bit different. I think when it comes to what we're discussing, it's the importance of helping to create the new leaders, whether they're younger or even older and just haven't found their voice yet. How do I create more Judys in the world? How do I create more Julies and more Lindas, right? One of the things I noticed when I was doing the mentorship with entrepreneurship is one of the biggest things I worked on with brand new entrepreneurs was their confidence. Because they would come in and they'd say, like, who am I to do this? I can't do this. This is crazy. And I would really have to work on that confidence. And I would say, you're a leader. This is giving you a platform. And I would talk to them about the responsibility behind that, and how as a CEO you get invited to tables other people don't. So what are you going to do with your table? And they didn't realize what they were getting themselves into, right? So there's a lot of power with our voices. So being able to help people to build up their confidence and leadership, and putting that support around them, because I think everyone on this call, we're all people who speak publicly, know that it can be challenging, and we need to be supports for one another, because it can be difficult. People can challenge you or try to silence your voice, and that can happen. And so we need to support one another. The other thing I'll talk about is the power of storytelling. I don't think that's been brought up yet. We talk a lot about that in Indigenous communities and cultures, the power of story. Story can be medicine. Story can be, making us a warrior. Stories are really powerful. And so how do we get more of our stories out there? It's so incredibly important. You call this the history project. Maybe it should be the her story project, right? something to consider. And then I really liked, I think might have been Linda or might have been Julie talking about sponsorships. I really like the idea of fellowships. If there's women that's doing really important work, I think being able to fund them to help further support them if they're doing, new initiatives that aren't paying them, or really leading really important volunteer or grassroots initiatives, how can we maybe give them fellowships and be able to support that work and put a community of care around them and saying, what do you need and what can I do to support you? I think that's really important. And then back to the confidence building, I'll just share this really, really quick. There was a woman, I can't remember her name, but she had a business and she would teach people how to talk to media, specifically women. And she said one of the things that inspired her is when you looked at the statistics, she said a man was more likely to talk to somebody in the media and not have the expertise required. Whereas women would be more likely to say no. Like if a woman didn't think she had the expertise or knowledge, she would not talk to the media. And so women are underrepresented in the media. And so again, it comes down to confidence. I think that's incredibly important. And so, yeah, how do we get the stories out there? How do we build up leaderships? How do we support people with the circle of care when they're on their way up? And also realizing that it's going to show up in different age groups. That's really important. I bring this back again. Youth is important. We should start them as youth because my goodness, like if I had the confidence of some of the youth I've met when I was younger, that would be incredible. But there are people in their 40s that haven't found their voice yet, but they could with the right amount of support, and they can do some really incredible work if they have that.
I'm going to say there's people in their 50s and 60s that are only finding their voice now. So let's not be ageist about it. I'm going to leave it to Judy and then I'll wrap up. We may be just running 5 minutes late, but Judy, and then I'll wrap up and say.
I just want to start on the issue of diversity because I heard a panel about a year ago and Janella Massa, who was a Black woman who was a CBC News reader on television, said that they hired her to have a Black face, but they didn't listen to her or the wisdom of her, or have any interest in the wisdom of her community. And I found that very powerful because there's a lot of, there can be representation without representation, right? The same with women, right? There's women who get into positions of power and then act as part of the patriarchy and don't support other women. I mean, we all know about that, right? But the same, but with people, I think with racialized people and indigenous people, it's much more that when you're in a position of power, and I saw this when I was president of NAC, if you are effective, they really try and co-opt you, right? The powers that be, they try and get you to act like them, that's the right way to act. And if you want to be successful, you have to act like them. And sometimes we feed into that in the way we train people, right? So I think that's something we got to do some thinking about. In terms of the organizing, I agree we need cross-movement organizing, and we don't have it. And I never. Nora Loretto wrote a book. You'll remind me, Deborah, the name of it. And she said we need a NAC now. I'm not sure about that, but I do think we need cross-issue organizing and we tried to set up a coalition between the Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce and the CLC to talk about self-employed women. So even cross those differences, which used to be, which are quite solid differences, but not on the side of feminism. But tomorrow, CanWCC is having a town hall because Nancy Wilson, the CEO, has applied to the major projects office to have a section on care work. Okay. So the major projects office applications are open. She applied to get the money. And I think if all the different women's groups involved in childcare and in all the different areas, elder care, et cetera, support that application and at least publicize it, that would be a beginning of a coalition because it's an action that gets support, right? And then there's other actions that people are taking at the political level that can get support, right? So I think that's a thing we could learn. And the day after, the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives is having more of a policy panel on care work. So I'm feeling that there's motion around care work right now because of how terrible, sorry, I know some of you like Carney, how terrible Carney's been on these issues. There's some movement, and I think we've got to organize it, pull it together, and keep it going. And the last thing, I guess, I think that the fact that we didn't have an internet in 1980s is kind of not related to not having an internet now. Nobody had an internet in the 1980s, well, hardly anybody. And so we had other ways of doing things, phone trees, for example. Now nobody even answers their phone, you know. So what? Yeah. So you want me to end?
No, I said fax machines.
Fax machines. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, things are different now and you can't, it's really hard to function politically or work-wise or in business without access to the internet, for sure. But the other thing I want to say is I started Rabble.ca in 2001. We were the first independent online publication. I had an all-women staff for the same reasons that somebody mentioned earlier. All-women staff because the internet was completely male-dominated. Okay, and we did very well. We did very well because we were the only voice, alternate voice, right? And we thought the internet would democratize everything. But, you know, I talk about neoliberal capitalism as a worm, you know? It goes into everything and wrecks it. That's my opinion, okay? And that's what happened with the internet. It started as a democratizing tool, and then the billionaire bros took it over and turned it into its opposite. And so I really, that's why I'm, you know, people are supposed to get more conservative when they get older. Not me. Like, I'm more radical than I've ever been. Like, to me, the problem is the system. And we've got to change the system. And that's what I'm looking to the younger generation to do. Because I think they're like, I just had lunch with my great niece the other day. And boy, is she radical. Not politically radical, but just radical in the way she sees the world. And it made me very happy. So I'll leave it.
All right, thank you very much, Judy. We're going to just, I'm going to have a couple of thoughts, but this has been a really excellent discussion, and it's been an outstanding, thoughtful panel who's given us a lot of, you know, nuggets that we need to think about. And by the way, Judy, it's not that I think what Carney is doing on the economy, I think is really good. It's just that we need to get him to do all those good things on the other side of the equation. But the speakers in the last round talked, you know, Linda talked about sponsorship and measurable outcomes. I liked her phrase, the psychology, safety, you know, the safety of psychology. Inclusion is more than HR. You have to take a look at the budgets. You have to take a look at public policy and training. Somebody talked about capital. Collective action instead of a fragmented approach, I thought was a really important phrase, and about how working together was essential. I love the idea of revising a renewed version of NAC, where an umbrella organization can really celebrate its diversity, but also playing, I think, at some of the men's tables, like all these men's organizations. We should be in there. We should be in there, you know, pushing. That's what the labor movement did. You know, the labor women pushed, you know, pushed through their policies on maternity benefits and whatnot. So I think that the inclusion of women in predominantly men's organization. Somebody said working together rather than individually, and about the confidence. And I can, you know, from personal experience, the older I get, the more confident I am. Heaven help everybody else. And we all want to be new Judys. We're not alone. Somebody put in the chat about the National Council of Women, and one of the things that the History Project does is to take a look at some of the organizations that have been around. And one of the things that dismays me is that some of my contemporaries and certainly younger women don't know how long the YWCA has been around. 1880s, how long, you know, the Women's Institutes and what they did. National Council of Women, I think, was another one in the 1800s. The Voice of Women, another really important organization in the 60s. Shyra, you mentioned storytelling, and I think that's the one thing that the Women's History Project really wants to move forward, is on the storytelling. So that's why we have these events. Fellowships to support the circle of care. I thought the whole kind of Indigenous, the warmth that everybody gets when you have a circle and you have a conversation. It's not the hierarchical. It's the women's groups, the circle of care. and different ages. So diversity is also about different ages. So it's intergenerational. It's not just, it's, you know, certainly about the disabled group, disabled women, or the able-bodied women, you know, the, what do they call it? Able diverse women, the neurodiverse people, you know, there's so many different intersections, but it also is intergenerational. And action, perhaps action more than advocacy. So those are some of the phrases that jumped out at me during the last section. So in closing, I would really like to extend a heartfelt thanks to our speakers, to Judy, Rebick, Julie Savard-Shaw, Dr. Shyra Barberstock, and Linda Krebs. I think you've been an outstanding panel, and I think there's a lot that we can do. I'd like to thank my volunteer board, Ellen Beveridge, who coordinates our events and projects. She does our research and writes much of our Substack, and to Tiff Frost, who manages our social media and technical support. I would like to thank you all for joining us. If you would like to know more, please message me, go onto our website, and we can just roll the promo while people leave. So Tiff, if you can do that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.